Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're just about to get started with this week's webinar. The screen that you can see in front of you now is just a bit of information on the compatible web browsers that work with this system, Demio. And there's a little link there as well so that you can test your system is working. Hi there, Peter from Brisbane. I'm Lindsay Douglas. I'm based in the lovely little hamlet of O'Connell in the central west of New South Wales. Hi there, Annalise from Maryland's in South Australia. Sarah from Echuca. Julie from Charters Towers in Queensland. Robin from Biloela. Welcome to you all. Question for you in the chat function. It's the first day of winter today. We are going to have a top of 4 degrees today where I am in the central west. Tell me, what is the temperature going to be where you are today? You're having a good cold start. Hi, Heather from Condobolin. Janine from Rockhampton. Margot from Menindee. Welcome to you all. Oh, fantastic. 15 degrees, that's not too bad, Sarah. I don't know where that is, but that's not too bad at all. So you can see on your screen there the technical instructions. Just make sure you can hear me, you can see the slides, and you're able to use the chat functionality. This is our 5th webinar today in this series, and I'll be your Rural Aid host this morning. We've been hosting these since the start of May, and if you've just joined today because perhaps someone thought that you would be interested in community asset mapping, or whether you've been following all of the webinars, a welcome to you all. As I said, we started these back in May, and the theme that runs through all of the webinars is supporting small towns in rural and regional Australia. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we meet today and pay our respects to traditional owners for their continuous connection to the land, to elders past, present and emerging. We run these each week on a Tuesday at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, and the whole focus is on community rebuilding and resilience, bringing fresh ideas to help support your community. And we try to balance each of these sessions with a good component of theoretical information, but also practically useful information as well. So the topics we've covered are there to inspire you and help prepare you and your community for a post-COVID world. We have all sorts of ideas and discussions. We've talked about long-term viability of communities, resilience, discovering and fostering leadership. That was the topic last week with Rob Hunt. If you haven't seen it, there's a link in both the Rural Aid and Bank of Ideas website pages. Today we're going to talk about community assets. We talked about tourism initiatives a few weeks ago. Next week we're talking about grants. So there's lots of different topics that we're covering as part of supporting small towns in rural and regional and remote Australia. I'd like to thank Bushels. They're our wonderful partners for this, and they're getting right behind this initiative and this community endeavour. So I hope you've all got a cup of tea and you're all settled in and ready to go for a wonderful hour of discussion. You may feel you'd like to take notes throughout. That's totally fine, but we will send you a video of this within an hour of the presentation concluding. We'll also send you a couple of really useful handouts. There's a wonderful booklet. It's 2 booklets actually coming from Bank of Ideas that you'll need to look out for. They are wonderful resources. We'll also send you this slide deck as well. And we found in our sessions earlier that a lot of our friends in the chat section over here were wanting to share their emails and get in touch with people, and it was getting really convoluted and difficult. So we decided to set up a Rural Aid Community Builders Facebook group, and we're putting really useful resources, motivation, anecdotes, case studies in there. We want to hear from you too. What are you observing? What's working in your community at the moment? What can we learn from what is working locally? And we invite you all to join that group. I'll put a little link up in a moment so you can just click through and join that group straight away. Great to see all of you using the chat function. A big hello to all of you, and feel free to throw questions in there throughout. I will pop your questions in verbally to our guest speakers throughout the morning, And if we don't get to them, we will try and get to them in an email afterwards and respond to each of the queries. Make comments as well. If you've got a great anecdote, we love to hear those, and we will share them where we can throughout the session. Well, today we're running a really interesting session on mapping your community asset base. And I think it's a really good segue from last week's crucial discussion on the need for local leadership, for towns and communities to take radical responsibility for their own decision-making, their own future plan, what they want to be, how they want to get there, what they want to create. And one of the themes that we talked about in leadership was the need for purpose, because purpose creates that movement. It drives leaders. It engenders ownership over projects and assets. But how do you achieve purpose? How do you get a whole town to agree on a community plan? Well, today, to take us through the process of asset mapping, we're delighted to have Peter Kenyon from Bank of Ideas with us. He is a social capitalist, very well known to many Australian communities. He is a community enthusiast, and I think at last count, he had helped more than 2,000 Australian rural and remote communities facilitate fresh and creative ways to stimulate their community and their local economic renewal. So, Peter, what have we got underway today?
Good morning, Lindsay, and again, thank you for your passion for rural Australia. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to our community that we're creating, this community builders group across the country. Today, it is an interesting topic. It's that one that I think is absolutely vital, because as I look at towns going ahead and towns going backwards, one thing that stands out about every entrepreneurial community, and that is that they recognise that really development is an inside job. And yes, it is important to be aware of all those new programs and funding options that are coming up from outside and all those external resources. But at the end of the day, if our communities are going to go forward, it means that we have taken that time to really look at what we have. What have we got internally? What are those assets that we can actually work upon? I'd like to begin this kind of like a mini little workshop, and let me say what I'm attempting to do in just 20 minutes is what we normally take half a day to do. But don't worry, we've got a couple of interesting resources that will send you through that capture it all. But there are two quotes that I want to begin with, and I'll always love this one of Michael Proust, who simply put it well when he said, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And I think leadership is about having fresh eyes, looking at our community with fresh eyes and beginning to look at it. And the second quote I'd like to begin is this one by Mike Green, who put it well when he said, practical community action starts with the understanding that every community has more potential resources than any one person knows. And I suppose it's about how we actually begin to kind of like tease that out. How do we bring communities together to start really getting excited about what they have? How do we begin to discover? How do we begin to map? And how do we then begin to put together actions based upon our internal resources, supplemented always with what we can score from outside, but at the end of the day, the cake is very much what we've got inside. I want to also begin with two quick little stories, two stories that really have inspired me and helped me to understand it. The first comes back from the mid-1980s when two US professors from Chicago, Jody Kretzmann, John McKnight, basically went on an odyssey for 3 years. They basically crisscrossed the US and interacting with over 300 communities. They engaged in conversation with the residents of those communities. And basically, the start of that conversation was a simple question. Can you tell us a story of a time when you and your neighbours came together to make something better? And through those conversations, they assembled over 4,000 stories of community change. And what is interesting about the 4,000 stories when they looked at them, two things stood out. Firstly, change happened when they, the community, not someone from outside, not the cavalry running out from Washington or from Seattle, but when they in that community decided to take action, when they realized if it's to be, it's up to me. And the second aspect they discovered is when people began to realise that they had their own assets and resources, and that really part of that change was them beginning to discover that, map that, celebrate those assets, connect those assets, and begin to kind of like mobilise them. They subsequently went on to create what's called the Asset-Based Community Development Institute. It's an institute that certainly inspired many of us as community builders. And they wrote this amazing book called Building Communities from the Inside Out, A Path Towards Finding and Mobilising a Community's Assets. And that really was one of the first publications that really got us excited about how do we systematically begin to discover, map and connect the assets we've got. My second story is one that comes out of Kakadu, a place called Mudgeonbarty, the very first European settlement that actually appeared in this amazing part of the world. Today, it's the home of the Mirror people, amazing group of people, but a group who, in terms of number, are now down to about 33 people due to a whole pile of issues that have impacted negatively on their community. And I always remember about 5 years ago being invited to come to this community to fundamentally just facilitate a conversation. But in their words, a different type of conversation. They said, please don't turn up and ask us what is the problem. Don't turn up and ask us what are our needs. Don't turn up and ask and start to explore what doesn't work in this community. There's a whole pile of things we know that don't work in this community. We have unemployment, we have kids not going to school, we have domestic violence, we've got problems still with alcohol. But you know what? We know all about that. We don't need any more conversations about the half-empty bit of the glass. What we want you to do is to start instigating a conversation about the half-full bit of the glass. Let's begin a conversation about what we have got and what can we work with. And in that process, allow us to start to take control of our future. Help us to start to develop plans and actions in terms of where we went. And really, over a period of months, it was just basically using that oldest tool in the toolbox called conversation to start getting people excited about what they had amongst themselves. What are those people assets? What are those physical assets? They had this amazing lagoon that was in their backyard, an amazing opportunity to look at how we might develop some remote tourism type initiatives and whatever. They had people in their community that really had a whole pile of assets, and the more we conversed, the more we discovered what people really cared about. This is a great one of their leaders, Mark, who is one of the best artists within the Northern Territory, someone whose art can sell for up to $20,000. But the more I got to know Mark, the more I realized that art, yes, was important to him. Yes, he loved it. But you know what? It wasn't the thing he cared most about. What he really cared about was horse riding. He'd been raised on a station. He had this amazing belief that the relationship between a young person and their horse was one of the most important behavior forming relationships that you could ever have. And he had a passion about young people, and particularly about young men in his community. And he had a passion about looking at developing up a horse riding tourism initiative, not just because it could provide jobs, but because also of the benefits of this relationship that he believed passionately in between a young person and their horse. And over a period of kind of, like I said, months, these conversations happened and they began to kind of like discover their assets, but then engage in this process of starting to map those assets and above all, begin to kind of like connect those assets together. And as they began to do that across their community, using this thing simply called conversation, not meetings, conversation, they began to develop the type of direction that they as their community want to go. And ultimately, it kind of like came out in terms of this map. They saw that they wanted to develop that kind of like that community garden because they had people in that community who not just love gardening, but had the skills to do it. They had people in that community who could actually put up the fences to keep the roos and the emus out. They didn't need any grants. They had the capacity to begin to do things for themselves and whatever. And through that process, they quickly began to discover what are the things that we can do ourselves. We don't need any help from what they used to refer to as the white Toyota cavalry. We could actually do a whole pile of things. But then secondly, there were things they recognised they needed some help with. Mark loved his idea of horseback tourism and recognised he needed some technical help from people in the tourism sector. And then thirdly, there were issues that they knew they couldn't deal with. And one of those was domestic violence. And therefore, what was the things we did need outside resources to help us with? And so as they work through that process, they start to evolve where their vision could go. And certainly for them, that vision kind of like was multifunction, but based upon what they actually had. I always remember as part of that process an amazing experience when one of the young men in that community, and we connected because we had a passion about Aussie rules footy, and his name was Jonathan. He took me for a walk one day and he said, "Peter, can I take you for a walk on country?" What I didn't realise, it was 12 kilometres and it almost killed me. But eventually we ended up on this amazing hillock. And as we looked out, he said, "Peter, what do you think of my country?" And if anyone's been to Kakadu, you know it's stunningly beautiful. And immediately all I can say is those words, "Wow, this is amazing, this is beautiful, this is stunning," and so on. But then he said, "You know what, Peter, where you and I are sitting, there's something interesting. We had archaeologists here about 6 months ago, and they claim that this spot where you and I are now sitting is the oldest known settlement site in the world." Peter, is that one of those assets that you keep talking about? And boy, it almost blew me off that rock. Here we were sitting on a rock that actually was the most identified site for the oldest settlement site known anywhere in the world, going back 70,000 years. What an incredible asset for a community that was wanting to look at what is it we could start to do in terms of kind of like tourism. What did I learn from people there in Mudge and Barty? Well, really, that's the list of things. Firstly, never start with what doesn't work in the community. Always start with the half full bit. There are always kind of like assets there. And really our role as community builders, as leaders in our community, is really to help the invisible become visible. The third thing that I discovered is that everyone, no exceptions, cares about something. It's what motivates them. And you know what? That's the greatest asset that you discover in community, is what people care about, because they're prepared to kind of like work around that. Fourthly, more conversations, less meeting, less services, more community. And the final thing I will always remember is communities are untapped reservoirs of possibility. And so that simple process over those months really left in me really the belief that every community has kind of like amazing assets and resources they can work on. You know, Kretzmann and McKnight, basically in developing their asset-based model, basically said every community, there's two paths and two solutions. We can focus on what's not there, the needs, the services that we need to kind of like make those needs. We can then see that really people are clients, consumers, recipients of what other people are going to do for them. And always the answer is we need to get a program. We need to kind of like find out what the latest government program is, and that becomes the path. But then what Kretzmann and McKnight did was to say there's another path, and that's really focusing on the assets. What is there? And it's about focusing on how we begin to connect those contributions. It's about beginning to see people in community not as clients and consumers and recipients and service users, but as citizens, beginning to see them as co-designers of what could actually happen within their own community. The asset-based model, and particularly Jody Kretzmann, always used to love this analogy. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? And the simple answer is it is both half full and it is both half empty. But Jody always reminded me that you can't do much with the top half. It's the bottom half that you can work with. You need to be aware of the top half. Every community has challenges. Every community has deficiencies. Yes, there is declining population. Yes, there is empty shops in our main street. Yes, there is young people leaving and not coming back. Yes, there is kind of like a whole series of issues that exist in our community. We need to be aware of it. But more important, let's be aware of what we do have, because it's by discovering that we can then deal with the half-empty bit of the glass, was always his kind of like message. Yes, every community does need to do a needs map. And certainly all of our funders are really focused on making sure we actually have identified the problem and the needs that we can use their money to fund. And yes, I find that most communities have that map. In fact, most communities can give me that map in less than 10 minutes. But what I find is that most communities haven't, though, done the asset map. And all communities need both maps. They need both a needs map and they need an asset map. But can I say this one is infinitely more important? While, as Lindsay said, I probably work now across the globe with well over 2,000 communities. Almost every one of them have actually shown me their needs map. But I can almost count on two hands how many communities can like show me their asset map. This is the one, though, that we need. This is the one that we need to kind of like start focusing upon. It seems to me you don't need to drive far around Australia to see the difference. And I always love this sign. We have 2 cemeteries and no hospital. Very much kind of like a need focus. But I love being in a Canadian small town last year, and really I love this at one of their fairs. Old coots giving advice. It's probably bad advice, but it's free. But, you know, that recognition that everyone in our community has something to offer, and the way that kind of like people can be mobilized to be contributors is really what's important. And it seems to me those 2 bits of humor in many ways summarize kind of like the message, the simple message that I'm trying to give kind of like to you this morning. What's asset mapping? Well, it's not just about mapping. It's not just about discovering and identifying what you got. You know what the most important word in that is? Connecting. You kind of like map, not to count, but to connect. You map to kind of like find connections, to mobilize all those strengths and resources and capacities and aspirations that people have got, to kind of like mobilize them, to kind of like use in terms of where you can actually go. Now, as I said, in my remaining 10 minutes, I just want to give you some examples of how you can do it. It's something that we, as I said, normally take half a day. But at the end of this workshop, there are 2 publications that we put together. One's called A Guide to Asset Mapping. It has all the examples and heaps more that I want to share with you this morning. But secondly, also another guide we put together which talks about how do you go about engaging people, and above all, using the most important tool, that tool called conversation. So both of these will be kind of like sent to you in terms of being able to download. We always talk about there are 6 key critical assets, and by far the most important is number 1, it's people's passions, their skills, their connections, and as I said earlier, above all, what people care about. You know, the most important question to find out is what is it that people care about, because that is their motivation to act. There's the physical world. There's all those communities and networks, formal and informal. You know, I'm part of a faith community, a local Catholic church. That's a community. I'm also kind of like part of the Docker Footy Club. I'm also part of a e-bike old codgers riding group. It's probably more of a drinking group than a riding group, but it's an informal group. It's a community. There's a whole pile. All of us belong to multiple groups, and communities are made up of that. And then within our communities, there's all those institutional organisations. To me, the most important is the local school. It's an amazing asset. And then there's the police station, those health institutions that we have, those NGO groups and service providers that commute into our community. They're also part of those institutional assets. Then there's all those economic and business assets, the formal ones you see in our main street, those backyard ones, and also the ones that belong to what I call the exchange economy, you know, the swap meets. That's a form of economic asset that, again, can be quite useful to a community. And finally, every community has stories. Every community has cultural assets that, again, need to be discovered, mapped, and above all, connected. The process, and again, the handbook and the guide will go into each of these, but basically there is a simple process about how you might actually undertake that. But above all, there is kind of like no one way to do it. You know, I always say when you've seen one asset map, you've seen one asset map. When you've seen one way of doing asset mapping, you've seen one way of doing it. There are multiple ways that you can engage in this process. At the heart of it all, though, is that the most important tool we use is this thing called conversation. And again, I love that quote from Margaret Wheatley. I think it really puts its finger on really where the power in all of this stuff lies. Learning conversations are important, and how do we bring them together? And there's just multiple ways of doing it. One little tip I've learned is it is important in terms of how many people around the table. I personally think 5 is the best number. 6 is okay. I actually think 7 is probably one too many. Certainly 20 people, 100 people in a room is no longer a conversation. How do we kind of like use methodologies? And again, your facilitator guide that you'll get will talk about some really interesting ways, things like cafe conversation, open space, and some of these methodologies that you can actually use. Again, in terms of it, how do we actually start to record that stuff? And this is just one of the kind of like tools that we use a lot of. And again, there are multiple kind of like examples of that you'll see within the guide. We can use surveys. And again, last week, Rob Hunt talked about an organisation he set up called Lead On, a youth group. Well, this is one that I learned from him all those years ago, a community skills and passion audit, where you basically are asking people to share those things of the head, things they know, knowledge skiff. Everyone knows something about something. Well, how do we record that? Hand gifts, those things that people enjoy doing that they'd be willing to share. Some people know how to garden, some know how to bake, some know how to facilitate a meeting, some people know how to solve a problem, some people know how to put a social media campaign together. They are what we call hand gifts. And then the heart gifts are really so important. They're the things that people believe in. I'm passionate kind of like about involving young people in development. I'm also passionate about my Freo footy Docker team. They are kind of like gifts of the heart that I kind of like bring. And I'd always be willing to get engaged in projects around those type of things. A friend of mine, Denver de Cruz, has a simple thing. He works a lot with sporting teams and ticket cricket teams, many of them struggling to kind of like get people volunteering and stepping up to take on leader roles. And basically, so part of the problem is most of those groups don't have a simple way of discovering their membership and what turns them on. And he has a very simple, what he calls the 3 club question. What's your job? What are your 2 main passions? And what skill could you contribute to our club? And he says it's amazing what actually comes out of something as simple as that, as a way of when we introduce people and when we actually kind of like instigate membership. There are ways that you can generate ideas. And today we're going to finish this whole webinar with an amazing story out of one town. And again, the way that they generated their big ideas and how they did it. This is just one of the cards that we use. And again, this is what's on the back. What I love about this exercise, it's not just asking for people's idea. My big idea for my community is, but halfway down, the much more important question is, and I could contribute to making it happen by. The second one is even more important than the first one. There are things that you can do to what we call to the best of lists. And I was part of a group here called All We Need Is Right Here in my community of Kalamunda. And I always remember a group of young women who were kind of like motivated by what is there for our young kids to do. And they came together over a good bottle of red and started to brainstorm all the things they called the 50 things that all kids should do in Kalamunda before they turn 12. I think they generated well over 150. They put it down into 50, and then they printed that up as a card that now sits on the fridge of kind of like most families in our community. But again, you know what? This is an asset mapping, kind of like a way of kind of like gathering those invitations. One that I love is just the harvesting of stories. And again, the lovely story out of Mildura where 15 story writers went into one of their aged care facilities to listen to 15 storytellers. And then those 15 stories were put together into this book. An amazing exercise. 250 people turned up for the book launch. And wow, what a way of discovering the wealth that exists within those seniors within that particular community. Again, that is an amazing example of an asset kind of like mapping exercise. I love Love Notes. This is the one that Coffs Harbour used. There was a similar one down in Albany where basically in the shopping centre constructing the love tree and getting people to record what is it you love about our community. And again, there are a whole pile of variations of that you can actually utilise. One I love is just getting people on post-it notes to indicate, as I said earlier, the head, the heart, the hands, and I've added a thing called the feet. We all have connections. I live next door to the mayor. I'm a member of a Rotary Club. You know, they are assets that we need to be aware of. And again, just getting people within meetings, within special events and whatever, doing that type of recording. And then it's amazing to see what actually ends up coming out of it and so on. There's a community cafe that was set up in a small town in New Zealand. And again, the way that all was instigated was just bringing people together who were interested in creating a community cafe. And the starting point amongst the 8 people that turned up was say, what are the gifts that we could bring to make that actually happen? And again, that's created an amazing community project in the little town of Granity on the west coast of New Zealand. There are so many ways that we can just simply begin to kind of like gather those kind of like assets and resources in terms of where things can actually go. And then obviously, how do we then begin to kind of like share those things? And again, there's a couple of amazing ABCD projects happening in the suburbs out from Launceston in Tasmania. And this is one, the community of Melbourne had this I Love Melbourne campaign that was supported by the city of Launceston. And again, I just love the way that they took the I Love Melbourne campaign and really got people aware in that community of the amazing range of resources. They are asset rich. And boy, look what we've got that we can actually build upon in terms of how we might actually do that. There are so many different ways that can be captured. This is the community of Rochalee, which is another one of those Launceston neighbourhoods and whatever. You know, one of the amazing gifts that popped up when that asset mapping exercise happened. I'll never forget someone said, well, you know, we've got an Australian cricket captain that was actually played in our cricket team, was brought up in our town and whatever. You know, lots of people in the room never even knew that. But in fact, they had kind of like this cricket captain that kind of like came out of their particular community. So can I, as we bring this together, just leave you with a quote, one story before we introduce our special guest and ask her how she and her community went about it. And again, my mate Mike Green, and he put it very well when he said, asset mapping is not data collection. Words on a list have no power. The person of asset mapping is to create relationships that mobilises and connects the community assets for productive action. And, you know, at the heart of community building is relationship building. What is community building? It is relationship building. And what ways can we go about it? There's nothing more powerful, I think, in starting the building of relationships than to engage people in an exercise where they not just discover what they've got, they begin to see the links between what they've actually got. Can I close by one of my wonderful stories that I just love, and I've known it now for several decades, but the story of Holbrook. And I always remember Holbrook, you know, many of you will, it's on the major highway, the number one highway in our country. And you know what, right through to kind of like the early 1990s, this is a town that never had to worry about people stopping in their town because simply they had tens of thousands of cars every day driving through. I always used to laugh at their sign. You know, this was a town that I felt was quite lazy with its signage. I mean, a Premier Driver Reviver town. I mean, unless you're an alcoholic, why would you be interested in this town? You know, towns are meant to tell us what's special. And that's the best that they could actually come up with. And then like some other towns, they'd love to throw in their population and their elevation, which is really irrelevant to 99.999% of people. But that was Holbrook, and Holbrook didn't have to worry about attracting people. As I said, tens of thousands of people drove through that town every day. But in the mid-90s, something changed all that when they decided to bypass the town. And suddenly, those tens and tens of thousands of cars were not driving through the town. And the town was really looking at an economic disaster. And it was then that people started to come together and say, what is it we could do to kind of like reinvent our town? And it was then, as part of that exercise, people started sharing what are the assets we could work on. And I'll never forget someone talked about the fact, you know, it's our name. And I had no idea where Holbrook came. I always thought it was to do with Holbrook sauce, but no, it all came from this guy called Commander Norman Holbrook, who won a VC for going under the nets and blowing up a couple of Turkish ships there near Gallipoli in the Dardanelles. What was interesting is that when World War I broke out and the Dardanelles campaign was on, Holbrook was then called Germantown, not really in the midst of the most patriotical war we've ever known, to be called Germantown. And the local council looked at a newspaper that day and saw that this guy, and he wasn't even an Australian, he was a Brit, had kind of like won a VC medal for being the first submariner to kind of like get a VC. And they wrote to him and said, we want to change our name. Could we use your name? And back came a lovely message saying, I'd be delighted to have an Australian town named after me. Well, the time marched on, they changed the name, and in the mid-50s, this guy turns up, and the first thing he says, I'd like you to meet my new German wife. And the two of them become then attached to the town. They donate the VC medal, they provide money for Holbrook kids to be able to go to university, and they become attached to the town. And the town responds by creating a memorial park and building a replica of his little submarine that he won his VC medal for. Fast forward back to the 1990s when the town is facing disaster. The town is about to be bypassed. And people said, you know what? We have a claim to being a submarine town. Can always think, submarine town, you're almost 400 kilometres inland, you want to be a submarine town? But, you know, they had this story, they had this amazing story of kind of like Commander Holbrook. And so they decided, yes, we're going to buy an Oberon, a second-hand Oberon submarine. It cost over $100,000 to kind of like transport it. Interesting is that I believe that the German wife, who was much younger than Commander Holbrook, was still alive, and she donated the money for that to happen. And boy, has that been a stopper. Has that given people an excuse to kind of like go off the main highway, all around a story, an amazing story. And they've developed up an interpretive centre and really have built upon it. Keeps going. I love a couple of years ago, there was the 50th anniversary of the famous Beatles song, Yellow Submarine. So what did? They kind of like went out on social media and invited people all over the world to send in yellow yarn to yarn bomb their submarine. Close to 3,000 people responded. Media came from all over the world to record this, and boy, the publicity that this got was just amazing. So the story continued on. And to me, it's just a lovely, lovely example of kind of like how this thing called discovering your assets and beginning to connect and beginning to link them to other things can actually go somewhere. Can I close with a wonderful, wonderful Maori proverb and song? Whenever you're welcome onto a Maori marae in New Zealand, this is one that they'll often, one of the pieces of music and song and words that they'll often ask you, with your food basket and my food basket, the people will thrive. And I think what we've got to realise is that what we can get from external providers and funders and government programs, it's cream on the cake. If we really want to have a sustainable future, it's beginning to discover the assets within. Community building is very much an inside job. It is about discovering what we've got and beginning to connect that. And through that, motivating and engaging people in kind of like that community building exercise. One of the places where that has happened most recently and in wonderful ways is a little town just out of Lorne on the Great Ocean Road in Victoria, a place called Deans Marsh, who've engaged in an amazing exercise. And today we're privileged to have the coordinator of that exercise and the coordinator of their local neighbourhood house, the cottage, they call it, the Deans Marsh Community Cottage, Lisa Jarvis. Welcome, Lisa. Tell us your story. How did you go about beginning to bring a community together, focus on its future, and what role did this asset mapping process play? Tell us your story.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the first part of that, Pete. That was fabulous. So some time ago, I'd heard about Peter's work in asset mapping, but I'll start just by telling you a little bit about Deans Marsh and District. It's the centre of my universe. We're an eclectic community. Lots of artists, tree growers, traditional farmers, the odd hippie, professionals and creatives. And look, what triggered our process was the local council coming in and saying, this is what is going to happen in your town in a thematic strategy. And it didn't resonate with our little community. So it was time for us to mobilise ourselves, basically. So we gathered ourselves to look at what did we want for our future, and MADCAP happened. So one of the best props that we had were these hats. And MADCAP basically is what happens when a small country town has a really big conversation. One of the first things we did was to come up with our little logo, the MADCAP, make it happen. represents the blue skies and diversity within our community. Wedge-tailed eagles, frogs are pretty important to us. Elders are represented in that, young families, artists, and of course dancers and a couple of people that can do somersaults. So really, I'm not sure if you've heard of the term chin wag. That's what happens to your chin when you have a big chat. And that's, look, basically what we did. We want to continue to have conversation as part of the culture of our community. You have short-term gains and you have long-term gains from that. Basically, it was about asking 4 questions in our community, the MADCAP process. It was, what do we want to retain? What do we want to change? What do we want to regain? And what do we want to create? And the other really important bit was about mobilising our assets. We can know what our assets are, but unless we mobilise them, they just stay static. So a big part was looking at who's in our community. Individuals were highlighted as a key asset, as were all the things that institutions have, as well as some of the people could help us to make our vision become a reality. You'll see that we did quite a range of engagement activities. Started small, introducing the process to town, really looked at how do we let everyone know that they can be involved. Now, a quick thing, not everyone is going to want to be involved. I did have a question, what do you do about the cynics and the skeptics? Have a chat with them. Some people will then want to be involved, others won't. That's okay. I think you go forward with an open heart and being authentic about what you do. So in our little town, we have about 289 people in the township, about 600 in the district. We had about 440 people participate in that stage. So look, really happy with that. And some of the cynics and skeptics are now going, oh, that doesn't look too bad. So people will come along the way, and if they don't, as long as they've got that choice to participate, I think that's the primary thing. The other thing, working with the Bank of Ideas, as you can see from the first part of this, Pete's got some great resources, but I think it's about making them localised, so adapt them to your context. So here, we're a traditionally farming community. So the big idea postcard was thinking about the ideas that wander around the top paddock. Anyone that goes for a walk in nature knows that's when you get your best ideas, but also some people aren't comfortable having a formal conversation, but they'll have a chat across the back fence. So conversations in all settings and all types of places, and in really non-threatening ways is what we were after. We had 180 responses to our big idea postcards, which I think was a fantastic start. One of the things that MADCAP, now our acronym, the Marsh District Community Action Plan, kind of worked well because it meant we could use all these great props. Now, you're going to take me seriously if I ask you a question in a silly hat? No, but you're not going to be threatened either. So I think when you're looking at things in your community, find fun ways to engage. The photo on the left there, maybe it's your left, maybe it's your right. Anyway, that's features Mo in the pink hat. So Mo came down, we met the kids off the school bus, had a little conversation afterwards. That was fantastic. The other one was inviting people to host a kitchen table conversation. And hence you can see there was some great wine and cheese and things shared, and lots of silly hats. So non-threatening, put down the expert and just have a good chat with each other. Kev down the bottom is a fencer. Kev would never come to a formal meeting, but having a quick chat to him outside the local store meant that I was able to gain his ideas and insights, which is fabulous. Again, we've got 3 generations of MADCAPers on the left there. The school kids right down to primary school put up their big ideas for their community, and local businesses got in touch as well. So all the MADCAPs came out in Deans Marsh. One of the great things I think about having an open process and a process where you invite people to participate is that you'll have leaders emerge. So in this, we've got a lot of new families that have come to town, And people were invited to host a kitchen table conversation or a MADCAP family tea party. And so the people in this organised that all themselves, and we've had emerging leaders identified, people that I actually didn't even know. So through this process, they came forward. So you never quite know who is in your community and who wants to step up, given space, resources and encouragement. Now, the mighty MADCAP conversation. This is once we'd done all our survey work and our postcards and had the kitchen table conversations, we had the mighty MADCAP Conversation Cafe. And I will tell you, it was rowdy and it was meant to be. There was nothing formal about this meeting, but underneath the rowdiness was a really well facilitated process that meant at the end, we'd been able to identify what the priorities were for our community and some really concrete steps to make that happen. It also meant that people that had assets that they wanted to share to contribute to projects were able to put down how they could help. So again, rowdy, heaps of fun, great food, great wine, and obviously Pete, you could tell he was a football supporter in that. What did we learn from our community engagement? Well, one was that our community has a long history of wanting to determine our own future, and that we will stand up and advocate strongly for what we believe in, and also an amazing diversity of capacities and strengths within that community. That if we hadn't asked those questions, we wouldn't have known just what was in this community. I think many of you will be from small communities and you're having an ever-changing population. So it's really important to continue having conversations just to see who's about and how they want to help. So our community vision, to have a thriving rural community that balances care for the land and its people, which I think is beautiful. But what I think is even more beautiful is this quote that was spoken by one of the young people. If our community was currently music, it would have a slow, soulful rhythm. In the future, it needs a bit more pace to it, more layers and more instruments. And I know you could just read that, but I just wanted to speak it again because I think it's beautiful and really captures that we want to retain who we are and our village lifestyle, but we want to give it a bit more zhuzhing up. And it's certainly our young people that will do that for us. Now, our identity, the Deans Marsh way of doing things. Deans Marsh is really proud of its identity and that we do things in a different way. Every little community is going to be unique, and never underestimate the power of your uniqueness. The other things I love about this are the words emotional support, love, inclusiveness and environment, and being open. One of the primary things I think about any of these asset-based community development approaches is to be authentic and don't worry about doing it right. Just have a go. Jump off the cliff and you'll get your wings on your way with it. Now, our priorities in this came up very strongly. Our local community, number one, community connections and community infrastructure. Our local environment, our streetscapes need some work. Climate change adaptation, our whole community is going, how do we show ways and be the model of what a small sustainable community could be like? Land use and planning, that's something that needs unpacking. We want to retain being a rural community, but we want to, I guess, tweak a bit some of the things that can happen with land use and planning. Our local economy is a really strong, vibrant one. How do we market that? How do we support things? So today's not talking about our actual plan. If anyone wants a copy of the plan or more information, let me know. But it's really about the process that we undertook. And the process was about having a great big chin wag. Don't be worried about being serious. Have a go, enjoy the process, and know that, look, I think local governments and councils really make strategies and communities can action things and come up with plans. So go forth, chin wag, and have a great time with it. Hi, Pete.
It's a great story, and as we keep talking, we'll keep sharing some of the thoughts of where this is all going. But how important is it to be creative? How important important is it to kind of like do things different, to make people feel comfortable? How important is it to have multiple ways of kind of like asking the questions?
Look, I think it's really important to be creative because let's face it, we've all had a lot of engagement from local government. We all get the little surveys, we get the things that are very dry, but it makes it very dry and it's not fun. So I think coming up with something that's fun, that's relevant to your local community, really takes away the expert part of it. I think also people engage with things in all different types of ways. Some people are really comfortable coming along to a chat with half a dozen other people. Other people really appreciate a phone call to say, hey, have you heard that we're doing this? And would you like to be involved? We're all diverse creatures that have got different ways of communicating. So don't be afraid to ring people and say, hey, I haven't heard from you. And find, all sorts of ways. That
Lisa, we had a great question.
And I guess also that, sorry. Okay, you go now.
Please,
I'll just change,
a new hat per question, please.
The other thing
we had
a
fantastic question from Petra.
Okay.
Beautiful hat, by the way, love it. Petra asked, how do you keep your community action plan relevant when you have, people coming in and out of your community, changes in priorities, macro impacts? How do you make sure your MADCAP is relevant?
So alongside our community plan, we've got a great evaluation and monitoring program, and that sounds really bureaucratic, but what it basically means that we will continue to have conversations. The plan is a living document, so it means that every 12 months or so we'll look at where we're up to, and if people go, okay, we've ticked that action off, or it actually doesn't have relevance anymore, then it's continuously updating it, I think is the way to go, and not be afraid to say, oh, well, that's what we thought at the time, but now we have more information and we're going to update what we think because of that.
You've done the planning and you've come up with an amazing document. You've also put that into a really fun little YouTube, which is going around. In terms of those next steps, though, you're obviously now starting to mobilise despite COVID-19. You're really planning for the future. I know even the cottage, you're still not able to reopen that as yet in Victoria, but you've got plans to kind of like go take this into the future. Do you want to share a bit about what the future holds in terms of where you're going with now? You've got the printed plan and you've got it on a YouTube. How do you make all this real, and what's the ongoing steps in that process?
So I think there's internal community steps and there's the external stakeholder steps. So I'll talk about quickly internally. What's happened is that community members are starting with some foundational activities. So what we've had happening is the establishment of a little free pantry. We've had a grow free cart start. We've got community pen pals, and we've got ISO photographs being shared. So internally, the community are starting to do the things that make a difference to them and to keep those connections. In terms of using the plan to advocate on behalf of ourselves, we're presenting the plan to local government and also state government for them to endorse the directions that we're going on. The other thing that I've already found is the benefit of having a plan when I'm writing grant applications, because you've already done your community engagement, you're prepared, you know that you're advocating about what your community wants to do. So there are two things. One is working internally to do foundational. Externally, it's advocating and showing people our plan and presenting it. The third thing is we're teaching ourselves very quickly the range of online collaboration tools like Slack and Trello so that we can get those things happening. The other thing I'm doing is making sure that for people that aren't engaged online, I'm getting on the phone to them and keeping them up to date where things are happening.
Yeah. And Lisa, you're also planning, I believe, some community builder work, calling it community building workshops to upskill people. quick
Yeah.
for that, but I also the slide of Michael O'Mara from Mohow, who's probably one of our best youth facilitators in the country, had that amazing, I still remember sitting there just absolutely inspired, where we had, probably close to 30 in that critical 20 to 35 age group, sharing their dreams, their aspirations, but above all, the contributions they thought they brought to the thing. Can you share a little bit about that at the tennis club? That was a great event.
Yeah, that was a fantastic evening. And I guess one of the fabulous things is that a lot of those young people have grown up here locally, been away, done some studies, and come back to Deans Marsh, committed to making a change. We've got regenerative farmers and artists, etc. amongst that. I think what I loved also about that night, Peter, isn't only their commitment and their smarts and the fact they want to stay in this community, but also how much they appreciate the elders, which I will say I'm moving into that, the elders in terms of mentoring. So I think it's that cross-generational exchange around things. I think it's also about some of us older crew taking a little step sideways.
There's a quick question for you
those
from
young people to
Rick.
come through.
And his chat question is, how did you fund the process?
Hi, Rick. Okay, so we funded the process partially through funding from the cottage, from local government and from state government. So it was very much a partnership program. And I think the key thing for me is that state government and local government can write the strategies, but sometimes they don't know how to enact them. So that's where that place of communities coming up with answers to those strategies really works. And you put a localised lens on it and you make it relevant. So partnership is the way to go.
That's come through that I think you'll be best placed to answer. It's come through from Amber. How would you apply this to a larger population? Is it relevant? Can it be done?
As small town enthusiasts, and I'm certainly one of those, but we also have applied exactly the same approaches, and I'm aware of across cities. I've spent a lot of the last 10 years involved in the post-earthquake stuff in Christchurch, and we've used a lot of the similar kind of like methodologies within that city and within its neighbourhoods and whatever. I've seen these approaches work equally well across regions, and certainly we've had an opportunity of applying this even to countries. I mean, we've used the same methodologies to help formulate 23 national youth strategies in a host of African, Asian and Pacific Island kind of like countries and whatever. So numbers don't matter. What I think I've always learnt, though, is there's a limit to how many people I have around the table. And again, the smaller you can make it. You know, I'm a great believer in using cafe conversation, because I've had one where I've had probably in one of the Christchurch situations, we had 600 people there that night coming up with a plan for their neighbourhood, but they were all around tables of 6, and we served it over a 3-course dinner. You can imagine the chaos, the noise, it was all over the place. But you know what? People just went out that night, A, feeling they had a fantastic time, but B, we just generated, literally in that night, we generated well over 1,000 ideas of what could actually happen. I think it's about how you go about it. The methodology really matters. And that's why we've particularly tried to put that into the guides that everyone will get today. It's not the total number, it's how you actually go about it and how you actually break it down. But it applies to everyone, whether you're a community of 23 people in your town, or you're actually looking at doing this across the whole country. The community of Mandurah, they've recently done this amazing thing called Mandurah Matters. And again, that's a community of 90,000. And they've used a lot of the same methodologies to do that with the city of Mandurah.
Well, I want to thank you both so much on behalf of Rural Aid and, of course, our wonderful friends at Bushels. Got a bit of our red lippy on there. But we've really enjoyed this session today. Peter bringing the kind of condensed version of the workshop to us today so that we could start thinking about our own community action plans. And Lisa, for taking us through your journey, which really all started with the fabulous region that you're in, right near Lorne. But Lorne and Deans Marsh are two vastly different communities, and no doubt your very well-meaning Shire Council said, oh, we've got a plan for everyone, and your community got together and said, no, in Peter's words, if it's meant to be, it's up to me. And I love what you've done. I love your authenticity and the fun that you bring to what could otherwise be a very serious process. We have had such a good couple of weeks. Thanks for bringing us another good hat. Can you fit in another one before the end? You've got a ton there. Maybe keep moving through them.
Can I?
We have got a...
Yeah, look, this is the Otway Panther.
Oh, goodness. I'd love to be at your next MADCAP session. We have a wonderful guest next week, again, on a very practical topic of grants. We have Carleen Egan joining Peter, Kenyon and I. Carleen's from the Foundation of Rural and Regional Renewal. We look forward to seeing you all there. I've just popped a link up if you want to register for that session. And a big thank you to Lisa Jarvis, once again from Deans Marsh, and the incomparable Peter Kenyon from Bank of Ideas. We'll see you all next week.
See ya.